Okay, we know how to set the contrast of our image, but that opens up so many questions. What should be where? How bright should a face be? What's the ideal for a highlight and why? We've covered the very basic rule of thumb for contrast, setting our core blacks and our brightest whites. But we also recognise that those two rules don't apply all of the time. There are plenty of situations where bringing the waveform up to the top of the scope would not be appropriate, and there are also times when setting a typical core black is not the way to go. So then, how do we know where our contrast should be? There are a few variables that can complicate this, so we're going to break it down into different conventions and why and where they might be appropriate. Now, we've already covered the first, and I've graded this image according to that convention, where we set our core blacks at 0, and we set our highlights by eye, and then play with the mids until we're happy. Now, this is fine if you're just starting out, and it's also great for web videos as well, because pretty much what you see on your monitor is what you can expect most web viewers to see on theirs. And for the most part, this course is delivered online, so you all have a monitor or a laptop screen to work on. And I've used these basic conventions on most of these practical projects because I can't expect you to go and check this on broadcast or in an actual cinema. But when we think about cinema and broadcast, there are some different standards to keep in mind. Now, we go into much more detail on the differences between different viewing scenarios later, but for now you just need to know that monitors, televisions and cinema projectors display images differently. These differences are why we might choose to use a different contrast convention, because one of the key differences between all of these screens is something called gamma, which has a direct effect on the perceived contrast of our image. Now again, we cover this properly later. For now, just know that the three main viewing scenarios, which is web, TV and cinema, all behave differently. Now, with that out of the way, we can move on to the fun stuff. Let's take a look at a different way of setting our contrast and why we may choose to use these conventions as opposed to the basic core black stroke brightest white approach we covered earlier. Now, before we go any further, I'm going to change from the Luma waveform to the parade, because there's also a trick to read the parade that helps us get a pretty accurate read on the brightness and contrast of our image. The majority of the brightness in any RGB image is derived from the green channel, so that means that the green wave, down here in the lower right, gives us a reasonably accurate idea of our contrast without needing to refer back to the Luma waveform constantly. Now, it's not 100% accurate, as it's not a full reading of the brightness, but it is actually good enough for us to base a lot of our grading decisions on. So, let's take a look at a different set of contrast conventions. Like we did before, we're going to start with the shadows, and I'm just going to reset this one, and we're going to start from scratch. Now, on web videos, we do have a reasonably good visible range at the very low end of the waveform. This changes in broadcast and cinema though, especially in cinema. Contrary to the typical core blacks at 0 approach, there is another convention. We're going to bring our blacks down to roughly 90 on the scope, maybe about 65 or so, and I'm going to make this judgment looking at the green waveform down here. The green waveform is a reasonably good stand-in for my Luma waveform when I'm using the parade scopes. Now, we're bringing it down to kind of 60 to 90 and not 0, because the perception of detail is diminished when we go below 128 on the scope. Now, I say diminished, not eliminated. I find that leaving my shadows at 128, like this, it just looks too milky and washed out. It's a very kind of Instagram, washed out, blooming indie hipster look that I don't really like very much. So I'm going to bring my shadows down to around 60, between 80 and 60 around here, and that's okay for me. Now, on a PC or a Mac monitor, that does look a little elevated, and this look plays better in broadcast and cinema. Unless the client is going for a washed out indie type of look, I tend not to use this convention for web video. But in corporate ads for broadcast, it can give a nice refined feel. It can give that nice kind of not washed out, it gives a kind of relaxed feeling. It can be very good for things which are meant to be quite upbeat and very kind of pleasant, which is where most ads aim for. So this is where we can put our shadows, and I like there to be a little bit of bite in my shadows, so I'm just going to bring this down here. Cool. So next, we're going to take a look at the highlights, and there are a few things to keep in mind here. We used to just set our highlights by eye, but there's actually more to it if we understand the type of highlight that we're using. And there are two kinds of white in film. The first is reflected white, and the second is emitted white. Reflected white would be a white object, A shirt, a white wall, or any bright material. Any white object which reflects light back to our eye. Right? That's a reflected white. An emitted white would be a practical light, an on-set light bulb, the sun, the moon, the stars, specular highlights, which are those very shiny spots you get on glossy surfaces. There's also an argument for treating the highlights in clouds as emitted whites as well. Now, the upper limit for a reflected white is broadly considered to be 896 on the scope for the green waveform. Beyond this point, just like the shadows, the perception of detail is diminished, and things also begin to glow, making it look as if light is being emitted from that surface. So white cloth, walls, and anything that's reflecting white light should max out at 896 on the green channel. Now you can see in this particular shot here, we've got the actress's shirt, which is a reflected white. It's a white shirt, it's in the light. This is the brightest thing in our image. So I can stretch our highlights up until, there we go, the green part of that reflected white just hits 896, and that's much better than me dragging it all the way up to the top where it goes, you get that kind of bright glowy effect and we start to lose detail. So I'm going to bring my reflected white highlight here up to 896. Now emitted light is different. Emitted light can go all the way to 1023, just like a standard maximum highlight. This convention helps us a great deal when we're trying to get a feel for where our highlights should be. There's a simple question. Is the bright spot a reflective object, or is it actually emitting light? Once we can answer that, we know where to place it on the scope, and that's just a simple task, as we've seen. Now, because I've stretched out my highlights, I need to bring my shadows back down. So I need to there we go. Bring that down until about 80-ish there, and then just tweak the highlights again. Cool. So this image is starting to look pretty good. I'm going to do the standard thing now and add a bit of contrast, saturation I mean. Now I need to be careful with kind of glowing areas of the skin, and the shadows aren't as low as they could be, so they can take on a kind of glowing aspect if I'm not careful. I'm going to bring my mids down a little bit as well. So there's also one more thing that we can keep in mind, and it's specifically about skin tones, and that makes it very important. Remember, human skin tones are typically the most important colours in any film image, right? Because that's where the actors are, that's where the performance is, and by extension, that's where the majority of the story is in our images. This is a good one to keep in mind, as the contrast on a human face is extremely important. The big thing to avoid when grading skin is to give it an accidental glowing appearance. It looks odd and artificial, and it immediately reminds us that we're watching a film because it's clearly a technical error. We can avoid this by keeping an eye on, and you've guessed it, the green waveform. Now, when dealing with skin, the green waveform should stay below 768 on the scope to avoid problematic skin highlights. Anything above this can give us a very artificial looking kind of glowing highlight, which is best left avoided. So you can see the highlight in the green here. The red can go a bit higher because skin is red, but the green should stay below 768. That's kind of like the maximum for skin highlights. Now again, this is more of a broadcast stroke cinema thing. If it looks good on a web video doing that, don't be afraid of breaking this convention. It's a convention, it's not a law. The color grading police aren't going to kick your door in and arrest you for changing your mind on this, so don't worry. So what I can then do, if I bring it up, what we can see is those highlights on the skin appear to kind of glow and look too kind of bright and artificial. So I just need to bring that down, and maybe I'm going to add a bit of orange in. There we go. Maybe a little bit side of my shadows, clean that out a bit. And the overall contrast of that face is looking pretty good. I've got the reflective shirt at 896. I've got my skin highlights at 768. I'm pretty happy with that. So then I'd go on, I'd do all my secondary stuff. I can do all the other stuff we've covered so far. Now, one thing to keep an eye on, if the color balance of your image is a little bit off and we get a lot of red, then you can still get that glowing feeling if the red is super high up here. If the red's kind of above or on or above 896, then you're going to get weird glowing skin highlights. So you just want to keep an eye on that. If you have a lot of red in your image, what you might want to do is just push a little bit of cyan into your highlights to bring that back down again. Then you can compensate by adding a bit of warmth in the mids. And then you can get your skin highlights in a nice place. I'm going to bring my mids down. This is quite a dark image. Remember, it's about scarecrows that go around murdering people. So, there we go. There we go, and that's this image with the primary grades carried out to a different set of contrast conventions. These are good ones to keep in mind, because if you go ahead and you do the very popping, the very high contrast basic look, a lot of corporate clients aren't super keen on that, and they like this kind of contrast instead. A number of very kind of hipster indie style clients, I guess is the only way I can describe them, like it to be even more washed out. They really like the kind of almost log look. So you just have to keep that in mind and talk to your client, get a brief, get references, see the kind of things that they like. What you don't want to do is go, okay, yeah, I know how this should be done. Here's the basic contrast grade, and they go, oh no, wait, this is far too contrasty. So always talk to your client, always get that brief, and so you know what you're aiming for. Now, with these conventions in mind, we can better prepare our projects for broadcast and cinema, although keep in mind that you still need a calibrated monitor to do that properly. We can also use these conventions if we need a film with a different feel from the standard basic approach to contrast that we covered earlier. The only thing here that I would strongly recommend you stick to would be the conventions concerning skin tones. That particular convention tends to be quite useful under most circumstances. Unless you have very extreme or stylized writing, that tends to be a pretty good one. Right, so we've now got a more thorough understanding of contrast and where it should be. Once you're ready, click on through to the next lecture.